Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on Paths to Becoming a Diplomat. My name is Mary Hendrickson and I'm the Assistant Director of the Keating Institute for Irish Studies. My institute and the Nunavik Institute for European Studies are the sponsors of today's event. Both of our institutes are within Notre Dame's newest school, the Keough School of Global Affairs. And a central principle of the Keough School is that our students understand the interconnected nature of world challenges. There can be no better example of the importance of understanding that interconnectedness than diplomats. They are an extraordinary group of people who not only want to represent their own country on the world stage, but to forge bonds between people. They know that it is the human that connects us. I look forward to hearing the personal journeys of each of our panelists and their advice. Thank you to all. You're most generous for sharing your time with us. I will introduce them briefly in just a second, and then for all of you listening, please use the Q&A function to send in questions throughout the talks, and we'll have a good 20 minutes for questions in the end. So Ireland has an embassy in Washington, D.C., but also consulates throughout the U.S. for broad geographical regions. Our first panelist, Ragnar Almqvist, became acquainted with Notre Dame while posted in Chicago, and he is now the Press and Communications Counselor of Ireland's Embassy in Washington, D.C. Joining us as well are Paul Breen, Vice Consulate of Ireland's Consulate in Austin, Dermot Fitzpatrick, Vice Consul of Ireland's Consulate in New York City, and Sarah Keating, Vice Consul of Ireland's Consulate in Chicago. While all of our panelists represent Ireland, their conversation will be wide-ranging and interesting to students of any country seeking to find their own paths to becoming a diplomat. And at the very end of today's webinar, Anna Dozel of the Nunavik Institute will share with all of you how students at Notre Dame have a very special opportunity this January to take a course with the Nunavik and further explore the paths to becoming a diplomat. Ragnar, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So I'll start by introducing myself, and I think we're each going to do that and talk a little bit about the paths that brought us to this career. And then we're going to have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves about the role of being a diplomat, what it entails, and what lessons I suppose we can draw from our own experience that might be relevant for you. But as Mary mentioned, please do fire in questions through the chat or Q&A functions, and we'll look to pick those up in our conversation later. So just to start by explaining my name, I was their vice consul in Chicago for a year, and I think I delivered about 200 speeches. Each of them I had to start by explaining that I was in fact an Irishman, because Ragnar Almqvist is not a classically Irish name. And in my case, that's because my father is a Swede. He came from a little north of Stockholm, Uppsala, went to university there, learned the Irish language from a Kerryman. So they always said he's English. He spoke with a very thick Swedish accent. He spoke English like a Swede, but Irish like a Kerryman. But came to love and be very connected with Ireland. He was a folklorist, a type of anthropologist essentially, but who focused on collecting folk tales from old Irish speakers, primarily on the west coast of Ireland. And indeed, he lectured several times at the University of Notre Dame and would be well known to colleagues at the Keating Institute. Anyway, he met my mother, who was working at the University College Dublin, and she has a background as an author, a novelist and short story writer. And they fell in love and married. And there's a very sort of, within our family, kind of celebrated photo from their wedding day in Uppsala, a little bit north of Stockholm, where the two of them, dressed in their fineries, are sitting at a kitchen table just before the wedding ceremony was due to start. And rather than looking at each other, they're both deeply engrossed in respective books. And I tell that story really because it tells the background that I came from and the home where I grew up in. It was a place just absolutely full of books. And for me, as a sort of young boy and man growing up, it was very hard to look beyond academia or a career in either writing or teaching as a profession. And certainly insofar as I saw myself doing anything as a young man and as a student, it was really following in my parents' footsteps and going on to be an academic. So with that in mind, I studied English literature and German literature largely, and language in University College Dublin. I went on to do a master's in creative writing and pottered around for some time trying to write and writing some short stories. I was active in student politics and kind of engaged indirectly in international relations in that way, but I had absolutely no intention or even appreciation that there was a career path as a diplomat. And so the year after I sort of finished my master's degree, I saw kind of chanced upon the advertisement really that ran in our newspapers back home, and kind of applied very speculatively for it, and found myself falling through the rather labyrinthine process we have in recruitment in Ireland, and ultimately got the job offer. Thought I'll give this a shot for a year and see how it goes. Stuck around another year, got a posting to Stockholm in Sweden. So hard for half Swede to say no to being posted in Sweden. So I took that. 3 years later, came home, opted to stick it out at that point. And I've had a wonderful career over the last 13 years. I've had the chance to work in our Prime Minister's office during the Brexit referendum and sort of plan for Ireland's response to that referendum and see through the first 3 months of that quite existential issue. Had the chance to work in Chicago, to work in Stockholm during our financial crisis, and then have been here in Washington, D.C. the last 4 years. The first 2 as our economic counsellor, working on economic affairs. And then the last 2, as Mary mentioned, on communications and public diplomacy and cultural affairs more generally, which is sort of cleaves quite closely to my own personal interests. I'll leave it there in terms of introducing myself, and I said we'll circle back, but we each thought we'd reflect a little bit on, one attribute which we think constitutes a good diplomat, or a recommendation, really, if you like, of the kind of characteristics you might want to think and work on if you're interested in pursuing a career in diplomacy. And for me, my reflection is that ultimately a diplomat needs to be a storyteller. That's not terribly original given the background as that I have, but if you think about it, a large function of what diplomacy involves is telling your nation's story to the world. And it's an exercise in fashioning and refashioning that story, in conveying it to different audiences and finding different ways ultimately of presenting your nation's history, your nation's story in a coherent way. So you have to be kind of consider yourself a little bit, I think, in the role of a storyteller, the type of people my father would have interviewed and recorded from when he first came to Ireland 60 years ago. The kind of person for me, which my mother is as a novelist and short story writer today. And I think that's an important characteristic also for us, perhaps in particularly as Irish diplomats, because very much at the center of our national identity, and you could call it almost a national brand, except I don't think it's more authentic than that, is a connection to stories and a connection to art and to culture. And just as a sort of interesting aside, and by way of reference, I don't know, some of you, all of you are sure very engaged and following the campaigns here quite actively. And you might have seen yesterday the Biden campaign tweeted across their social media teams a really fantastic short video of Vice President Biden reading from The Cure at Troy, one of Seamus Heaney's early works. It was a piece of theatre, actually, but it's presented as a poem. And as I said, that kind of connection to language, that connection to culture and to poetry and the arts would be very integral to Ireland. And finally, I think the point about being a storyteller and having a story to tell and represent as a diplomat is probably a good thing to consider for any interview, not just approaching interviews in public relations or in diplomacy, but more generally. I think it's something I've learned as I've kind of grown up and had more experience with the interview processes, that the people I've seen who've been most successful in it have generally had a coherent sense of the story they wanted to tell about themselves. And in the 30 or 40 minutes they'd have an opportunity to speak to an interview panel, they'll have gone in with a sense of what they wanted to convey, the person they wanted to present, and usually have some sort of concrete narrative that they felt they would leave the interview board with. So as a kind of insight into what diplomacy means to me, and as a tip, if you like, for approaching your own interview processes in future, that's something I'd recommend anyhow. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, and I said we'll run through the four of us and then have a bit of a chat at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Ragnar. My name is Paul Breen. I'm the Vice Consul here in the Consulate General of Ireland in Austin, Texas. And my career path to joining the Foreign Service was unintentional as well, I would say. So I begin by saying that the education system in Ireland is quite different to the education system here in the US. And after high school, we apply when we're going into college for a specific course in college or university. And that generally comes with quite a rigid set of subjects in the curriculum. So by the time you're entering college on the first day of your course, in some ways, at least I felt, you're pointed towards a particular type of work. And this really presented a challenge for me when I was younger, because I had no sense really of what type of career I wanted in the long term. I'd always had an interest in history, politics, and international affairs. But my parents hadn't gone to college, so my approach towards going to university or to college was quite a practical one. And I ended up choosing a business course where there seemed to be kind of a solid pathway towards employment. Before I entered my last year of college, I took an internship in an investment bank in Dublin. And I knew immediately that I didn't want a career in the financial services sector. But I was eager and enthusiastic, and I worked hard throughout the course of the internship. And at the end of it, I was offered the opportunity to come back after I graduated in a year's time. Now, going into that last year of college, there was a lot going on in Ireland at the time. We were in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2010, and Ireland had been hit particularly hard by that. And, for me, the ground had shifted. I had grown up in an Ireland that had experienced this period of unprecedented economic prosperity. And, the thought of entering a career in public service, hadn't really been top of mind for me. But in my search for an alternative, I suppose, to returning to the bank after I graduated, I applied for a job in another part of our government, a government agency that had responsibility for trade and economic development. And the job really spoke to me. It was going to be an opportunity to work overseas as part of a team that would support Irish technology companies to expand and internationalize and to increase their exports. And particularly in the context of what was going on at the time, our national economic recovery in the wake of the global financial crisis was going to be heavily dependent on trade. So the idea of working for the Irish government in this capacity really appealed to me. So I took this job working for this economic development agency, and I was based in Boston. And my role was to advise Irish technology companies on market entry strategies for the US and promoting trade links with Ireland and talking about kind of key economic messages. But the part of that job that I loved the most was the collaboration that we had with the Consulate General of Ireland in Boston at the time, particularly when the Irish Prime Minister or a member of the Irish government was visiting. My exposure to the work of the diplomats in the Consulate General of Ireland in Boston was my motivation for, joining the Foreign Service one day. And, the variety of their work at the time really appealed to me. The political engagement, the political reporting, Irish community engagements, consular work, building relationships, all of that really spoke to me. And I really, from that point, set out as a career ambition to join the Foreign Service. But, the economy was this was 2013 at this stage, and the economy was, in Ireland was still getting going again. And there was a moratorium on recruitment, a period of time where the Irish public service was not recruiting actively. So I knew I needed more experience as well before I, was to submit an application to join the Foreign Service. And I was very fortunate when I was living in Boston that I, built a good relationship with somebody who worked in the Centre for Irish Studies in Boston College. And after I worked for Enterprise Ireland for 2 years, I got a job opportunity to go work in Boston College in their Irish Institute. And that was really a great experience for me because I had come from this very business background and, that was my skill set, but I knew I needed a little bit more to join our Foreign Service because we are generally, generalists. So in this job in Boston College, we used to get funding from the US State Department to organize policy exchange programs for participants from Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the United States. And I stayed in that job for about 4 years. I really enjoyed it. And it really did give me the opportunity to kind of broaden my experience. All the while, I had in my mind that I would, eventually apply for the Foreign Service when the opportunity came up. During that period as well, I also did a master's at night time. At the time, the master's that was available to employees at Boston College was an MBA. But there was a large degree of flexibility in terms of electives. And, I specifically took the electives that I felt would be advantageous to me if I was to apply to join the Irish Foreign Service someday. So took a lot of classes in international law, economics, public policy, international business law, that type of thing. And all the while as well, I realized that, if I was to join the Foreign Service one day and I had this experience in the US, perhaps I could do something to strengthen my knowledge of US politics that might help me if I joined the Irish Foreign Service someday. So I started regularly going to events with a public policy forum in Boston to kind of deepen my understanding of US politics and international affairs as well. So I joined the Foreign Service to 2017, so about 3.5 years ago now. I did a year in our headquarters in our communications unit, and I've been posted here in Texas for the last just over 2 years now. So look forward to chatting, to seeing some of the questions later on. As Ragnar talked about storytelling as a key attribute for a good diplomat. For me, I think commitment to public service is very important, and what comes with that, I think, sometimes is resilience, resourcefulness, and relationship building. And what comes to mind for me when I think about that is when I arrived here in Texas, and I was trying to get out and know the community here in Austin. Everywhere I went, they had met my colleague, the Consul General. And I think that was really, evident of somebody that had, invested so much time in building relationships in the period that he had been here, all with the view that those relationships someday might be advantageous to our work here at the Consulate General of Ireland. So, I think somebody that, looks at the big picture and takes every opportunity that presents themselves, all with the view of connecting it back to the pillars of our foreign policy. That for me is something that's very important. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Paul. Dermot, do you want to pick up the thread?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Dermot Fitzpatrick. I'm the Vice Consul at our Consulate General in New York. My path is sort of a bit of a long and winding road, actually. So I graduated as a chemist in the early 2000s, and like many people who graduated in diverse fields, immediately went into financial services. So I did that and found it every bit as enjoyable as it sounds. So I was quite miserable, and I was talking with friends who had gone to college with them. There was one in particular who had talked about his brother, who was in China and going to Africa and was, doing all these interesting things. And he was this thing called a third secretary, and I had no idea, had never considered diplomacy as a career or option. And so I was talking to my then girlfriend, And she was saying, "You're clearly miserable with this. What do you want to do?" And I said, sort of grandly and with no concept of what it really meant, "I want to be a third secretary." And she went and discovered a course in DCU, which literally said one of the things you can do with this degree is become a third secretary. So it being 2006 and the boom was going to continue forever, I left my job and went back to college. And it absolutely changed my life and broadened my horizons. And I graduated in 2009 in the middle of a financial crisis, which included a hiring freeze in our foreign service. So I then tried to get odd jobs here and there. I went back into a master's in politics. I was campaign manager during a general election for a candidate who finished 8th in a field of 9, and then got a JobBridge internship, which was a sort of government program to give people work experience in a very downturned market. And I got very lucky and got an internship in a government department, public expenditure and reform. And the people there were just wonderful, and I wanted to make sure that this wasn't an internship where I made tea. This was an internship where I got experience and learned about things. And it just so happened that department was also the department that decided on when hiring would begin again. So when they began hiring for third secretaries, they let me know and they helped me and they prepped me, and I was able to get through the interview process, a torturous process which lasted more than a year, actually. And so I started in 2015, and I initially worked in our disarmament program, which is Ireland's position on nuclear weapons and other sort of conventional weapons. We're against them, and it was just every cliche of representing your country, going to the UN, sitting behind the flag, and I simply just fell entirely in love with the concept of representing my country. I then moved from that to be deputy European correspondent during the Brexit vote, and then I was posted to Buenos Aires, where I was our deputy head of mission for 3 years. I went from deputy head of mission there to vice consul here in New York, and thinking about what makes a good diplomat. I think what I would have to say would sort of complement and build on what Ragnar and Paul said. In addition to having a story to tell and a sort of a patriotism and dedication to public service values, is being personable and curious is sort of crucial, because you are representing your country and other people are aware of that. So when they meet you, they're going to form their opinion of Ireland in some part on your persona and what you do. And so it's very important to build relationships with people, to go out and listen to their stories. And the Irish community in New York is absolutely gigantic and hugely diverse, and not always, as any family, not always entirely harmonious. So you have to go and you build relationships with people, and then hopefully when there are issues or speed bumps, the relationships you built gives you a bit of goodwill and gives you a bit of credit to sort of explain why one organization maybe isn't getting the support they feel they need, or why a president won't be visiting them on this particular journey, or any number of things that happen. But I'm just to close out, I think I may have flown through my path there a little. I hope I wasn't too fast, but I remember in my first year talking to a diplomat who had much more experience than me, and told me to never forget how lucky I was to have this job, and what an extraordinary privilege it is to represent your country. And if I don't convey anything else, I hope I convey that that's something that I have never let go of, and I hope to never let go of. And that's me, Ragnar.
Thanks, Dermot. Sarah, do you want to say words, and then we'll come back and start asking some questions.
Perfect. So my name is Sarah Keating, and I'm the Vice Consul at our Consulate General in Chicago. I've been in this post now for about a year and a half. I moved here in March 2019. Again, I have quite a different background from my other colleagues who have spoken. I'm originally from County Limerick in the Midwest of Ireland. So I like to think when I moved to Chicago, I went from one Midwest to another. It's a nice little connection. I grew up in a small rural town and just attended school locally. In 2014, I graduated from University College Cork with a degree in law and Irish. I don't think there was no particular reason that I wanted to study law. I think it was probably because like 4 of my cousins just before me had gone to study law, and I was like, oh, this seems like a good thing to do. After that, then again, for want of anything better to do, I went and got a master's in law from the University of Limerick. Despite having studied law for over 5 years, I think I always knew that being a barrister or solicitor or an attorney, as you guys say here in the US, was not something that I was interested in. In my 3rd year of college, I was able to do an internship, and while my other classmates were going to work for big legal commercial firms, I worked for the Press Ombudsman of Ireland and Conradh na Gaeilge, which is an Irish advocacy group. So I think even at that stage, I always knew that a legal career wasn't something that I was going to be interested in pursuing. Despite that, after I completed my master's, I worked for a year with the Law Reform Commission as a legal researcher. I think a lot of the skills I gained in that job have definitely been really helpful to me in my current job, in terms of writing skills, problem solving, analyzing large volumes of text, things like that. I think this is probably reflected in the fact that we do see a lot of people with legal backgrounds joining the Foreign Service, but as my colleagues here have displayed, it's definitely not a necessity by any means. For myself, I've also found it really enjoyable that I've been able to show people that there's other things you can do with a law degree besides becoming an attorney. And one of my lecturers actually invited me to be featured in the university prospectus to show just that, and to show people like the varying things that you can do once you've studied law. Like Paul, I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2017 as a 3rd secretary. I will admit that was my 2nd attempt at trying. I had applied the year before and not gotten through the 1st round. So if there's anybody out there that's really passionate about this career and thinks it's something that you would like to do, don't be put off if it takes a couple of attempts to get where you want to be. I guarantee it's definitely worth it in the end when you get there. I cannot honestly say that being a diplomat was something that I always dreamed of. Like Ragnar, I guess I kind of happened upon it when I got the job alert from publicjobs.ie or whoever it was emailed it to me. When I was younger, I used to always joke that someday I would be President of Ireland, and I guessed aspiring to be Ambassador Keating to somewhere is equally exciting to me at this stage. Even from an early age, though, I think I always could see that representing my country will be something that I would enjoy and something that I would take great pride in. I was lucky growing up to, for about the first 10 years of my life or so, we had 2 fantastic female presidents in Ireland, in Mary Robinson and Mary McAleese. So it never really occurred to me as a young girl that, a woman shouldn't be in a position of power. That just wasn't something that crossed my mind. As I mentioned, our former president, Mary Robinson, who subsequently went on to be the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. This ties nicely into my first assignment in the Department of Foreign Affairs, where I was assigned to a role in the Human Rights Unit. Like Dermot said, had loads of really interesting opportunities here, got to make national statements in front of the UN. I was also the Ireland's delegate to the EU Working Group on Human Rights. So it was a really fascinating role to have. And I was there for about a year and a half. As I mentioned already, I arrived in Chicago in March 2019. For anyone who has been to Chicago in March, you will know I picked the most fantastic time to arrive in this city as an Irish person, right in the middle of the build up to St. Patrick's Day, which is for Irish diplomats probably our busiest time of the year anyway. But I have to say, I enjoyed it so much. We were so lucky that year when I arrived. We had the then Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, in town, and also Minister Michael Ring for a visit. So my first week was absolutely jam-packed with their programme. I was a little bit worried that if every week in my job was going to be like that I wouldn't survive. But thankfully, not every week is St. Patrick's week. So there was some relief afterwards. I've really enjoyed my time in Chicago, I have to say. It's a very busy mission here. We cover a huge area, 12 states across the Midwest, including Indiana. So if there is anybody on the call that has any sorts of passport or travel questions, we are your port of call in Chicago. So always feel free to reach out to us. The work is hugely varied, and for the most part, it's really interesting. I've had the opportunity to meet so many fantastic people, build wonderful relationships, both within the Irish community and further afield. I've gone to travel to places in the US where I've never been before, in pre-COVID times, of course, but I had never been to Chicago before I moved here. So that in itself was a bit of a challenge. I had lived in Boston for 3 months a couple of years ago on a J1 program. And like so many Irish people, I think I have loads of family down in New York. So I'd been there plenty of times, but never come this far west. Since arriving, I've had the opportunity to visit so many places I'd never been. I've been to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, been down to Indiana to see the beautiful Notre Dame campus, which was definitely a treat. And I hope that I'll get to tick off so many more states before I have to leave. So I had to agree with what all my colleagues have said already about the skills needed to be a diplomat, you know, resilience, being curious, being a storyteller, all those things. I think for me, the most important thing to remember is that there's no one person or one type of person who fits this role. You know, we represent a varied society, so it only makes sense that we're a varied group of people. You know, I will admit that I nearly didn't apply for this job the second time around because I saw that they were looking for people with certain skills, and these were skills that I didn't have, certain language skills that I didn't have. So I was a bit put off by that, but I have to, of course, say that I'm so glad that I didn't listen to myself and I did go ahead and apply. I guess my one main piece of advice would be, don't do yourself the disservice of thinking that you're not a right fit for this role. The work that we do is so varied. There will always be so many different types of skills needed. And some of these skills are things that you will pick up in a myriad of different places throughout your life. You know, if you had told me a few years ago that I would be every other day making speeches to tens or hundreds of people, I wouldn't have believed you, because it's just not something I ever saw myself being able to do. I was also, you know, doubted myself too, because I didn't have any experience in international relations or working with international bodies. To be honest, I probably got most of my negotiation and people skills from the 2 years I spent working in the Zara clothing store, talking down irate and angry customers, which, you know, that's a skill you can take anywhere, to be honest. So yeah, I think it just goes to show that, you know, you can pick up highly relevant and highly transferable skills across a variety of past jobs or experiences, and it's all things that can stand to you in a diplomatic career. Yes, so that's it for me from my path. So back to you, Ragnar.
Thanks a million, Sarah. That's really, really interesting and insightful, I think. So folks, I mean, you have sort of a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker across the team here. In a sense, I mean, a lawyer, a business graduate, a chemist, and a humanities student, or as we call them in Ireland, a bum. So there's the point Sarah was making, I think, is a really relevant one, which is foreign ministries, this holds for the US foreign ministry as much as it does for ours, are designed to be representative of the country. And your country here in the US and Ireland, increasingly, it's one of the great virtues of Ireland today, in a way that wouldn't have been the case in the past, are very heterogeneous societies. And so it takes a heterogeneous foreign ministry to do service to a foreign service, if you like. We've had a bunch of great questions. One of them that I wanted to kick off on, and it sort of takes forward the few points we were covering ourselves there, relates to that question of language skills, and more specifically, you know, what are critical skills for a diplomat. My own kind of immediate reflection is first to say language skills are admirable and definitely an attribute, but certainly not an absolute deal breaker or essential. I myself, fluent in Irish, so I was raised through the Irish language, and would be fluent in Swedish, obviously enough, and have pretty good German. But a lot of colleagues across the department, wouldn't necessarily be polyglots, and it's not essential that you are. What for me is most essential in language skills is that you have kind of the confidence and capacity to communicate in your own language effectively, and to engage, in good standards, if you can, of writing. And then to the point I made initially, and this holds very much for the interview and kind of builds on what Sarah was saying, you need to be confident in telling your story and fashioning a narrative as to why you are a good fit, and your skills and the skills you've developed will fit the role of a diplomat, whether it be in the State Department or otherwise. So yeah, I didn't want to keep that out there. I mean, does anyone want to pick up on the question of what critical skills are, or what skills are most valuable, you think, for diplomats?
If I can jump in, I feel like I missed trick. I couldn't agree with Sarah more. The customer service part of it is huge, and it can be from dealing with an irate citizen who isn't going to help, or even in dealing with recalcitrant countries that you're trying to get to sign on to a resolution. And yeah, I can't believe that I didn't bring it up, but it is something. I think it maybe a little goes a bit with the personal, but being able to see it from the other person's point of view and be calm while at the same time being firm is crucial. And I think it's that kind of thing. Sarah's point that there's no one fit. Customer service experience is actually really, really useful, and it's part of the telling your story. There's no piece of experience or no piece of information that you have that isn't potentially useful in this job. And then on the language skills, I have very unreasonably poor Spanish, considering I spent 3 years in Argentina. So it's certainly from an Irish point of view, it's not a deal breaker.
Yeah, I guess I would just agree with what Ragnar and Dermot have said about languages not being so much a deal breaker. Obviously, fantastic if you have them, but I would also say the person that you are when you enter the Foreign Service is not necessarily going to be the person that you are as you move through. There's lots of opportunities for learning once you get into the Foreign Service. And, if it does become clear to you that there is a particular language that you're interested in picking up along the way, it's never too late to start that. There's always time to start picking up new languages along the way. So don't let that put you off applying. And yeah, definitely what Dermot said as well about the customer service. I found like sometimes when I was applying for jobs, especially when I left college, I did kind of give throw my hand at applying for like some of the legal internships and things. And sometimes I find sometimes you don't think that you have the relevant experience, and you're kind of embarrassed to put down that you spent years working in retail or customer service, but don't ever be. Like I said already, those skills can stand to you in the future, and you never know what the interviewer is looking for. And it's the skills that you pick up along the way are the important part, not where you pick them up, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. That's very good. I don't know, Paul, do you want to hop in, or we can move on to another question?
Yeah, I just to echo Sarah's point there. I think that's a great observation, that the person you are when you join the department or join the Foreign Service is not the person you're going to be in a couple of years' time, or in a couple of decades' time. And I think if you talk to older colleagues in our own Foreign Service, I mean, they quite regularly remark on just how much the role has changed. We are much more about public diplomacy these days, and the work of a traditional diplomat. Throughout the career of some of our more senior diplomats at the moment, it's just changed remarkably. So you have to be willing to adapt and willing to learn new skills, and we are fortunate in our foreign service that there is a kind of a tolerance there for learning skills, and also learning languages throughout the course of your career, which we're fortunate about.
Thanks, Paul. Had a few questions in as well. This is a bit more procedural and varies from country to country, but how our system works in terms of changing jobs or going on postings. I'll give a little reflection myself, and then anyone who wants to jump in can kind of speak to their experience. So in our foreign ministry, basically what happens is that exactly this time of year, in fact, it literally happened today, I think, our human resources sends around a list of the 20 or 30 places that are available for a junior or mid-level diplomat to apply to around the world. We have a pretty small diplomatic network, relatively speaking. Here in the US, we have 7 bilateral missions, actually 8 now with the addition of LA. So we have a very strong concentration of diplomatic offices here. But the US alone accounts for 10% of our global footprint in terms of missions. So we only have embassies in about 70 odd countries globally, whereas the US would have in and around 200, just about every country in the world, I suppose. And in our case, our embassies, and like our consulates, are mostly 2 diplomats, so an ambassador and a deputy ambassador. That's why it sounds very impressive when I said I was our deputy ambassador in Stockholm, but in practice, I was also our most junior officer in Stockholm. Anyway, I say that to kind of give an indication of the range of options that are available. So our human resources will circulate a list of 20 or 30 places where diplomats are due to come home. And effectively, we fill out a sheet with our rankings, 1 to 20, formulate some sort of argument as to why we feel we're particularly well suited to serving in a given mission. And that can be, pull on all sorts of arguments, really. It was easy enough for me to make the case to go to Sweden, less obvious to go to Chicago. But anyway, and you submit your preferences. It goes into a big machine. Well, not quite. Our management board, so senior officials, and it comes out the other end with decisions on where you go. And that's it. You head off. Someone has to go everywhere. So you don't always get your first few preferences, but you do get an option of going and experiencing somewhere totally different. And in many cases, I think the people who have got lower preferences have had better experiences abroad very often, because you make of it what you can. Anything anyone wants to add to that in terms of their own experience in posting, Sarah?
Well, my year, there was actually 48 options on the list. So there was truly something for everyone. And I kind of knew it that, I had my heart set on North America, and we were really lucky because, Chicago was there, Boston was there, New York was there. There was some Canada options too. But I remember I was sitting beside one of my colleagues one day, and she couldn't decide whether she wanted to put Dar es Salaam or Sierra Leone top. So it just goes to show that there really is, there's something for everyone, and every kind of, whether you're a really adventurous spirit or less so, there's just, it's a real mix of opportunities, and so many exciting opportunities to be a part of.
Yeah, my first time around, I think there was 20, and my top 3 were Dar es Salaam, Hanoi, and Maputo. And I didn't get selected to go anywhere. And the machine that Ragnar talks about, someone explained it to me as you put in your preferences, and then they take one of the management board, blindfold them and hand them some darts, and that's how the decisions get made. But I didn't get anywhere, and I was desperately disappointed and told not to take it personally. And then there was a mini list because some people had gotten promoted, and the vast bulk of my intake were already committed to other locations. And all of a sudden a list came up, and Buenos Aires was on it, and I found myself putting it down with very little competition. So you never know how these things turn out. Also, Ragnar, you've exposed my my pretense to seniority there, because I was deputy head of mission in Buenos Aires in a two diplomat mission, and then for 8 months I was actually by myself. I used to introduce myself as the most senior the most senior Irish diplomat in the Southern Cone, and hoped that I didn't get the follow-up question out of how many. So that was my experience with posting, and then I got very, very lucky with New York.
Yeah, we all got lucky coming here to the US, certainly, because it's a pretty unique place for an Irish diplomat to work, especially in March, as Sarah said. I had another question, which maybe Paul or either of you really want to pick up on, which I think is really interesting, and that is to what extent, if any, has being a diplomat changed our perceptions of Ireland? I mean, have you changed your views of the country in the period you've been a diplomat representing it? Anyone want to take that?
I mean, I can start off. I guess it's a very deep question, I guess, and I mean, I think, you know, I've been working now for the Foreign Service for 3.5 years, and we did have an election this year. And a new government come into place, and you know, I think, you know, when you join the Foreign Service, you know that there's going to be changes of government, there's going to be changes of directions, and you know, personally, you know, you may take a different view on certain issues, but you know, that is the job to represent the government of the day and the policy that government sets and the direction that they set. Has it changed my perspective of Ireland? I mean, it's definitely changed my perspective of Irish America. You know, I've, you know, a huge amount of our work here is interacting with people of Irish descent here in the United States. And I had spent time on the East Coast, and, you know, thought I had a very clear perception of what, you know, the Irish American community was about. And in this region of America, you know, we cover 7 states from the Consulate here in Texas. I am learning more about different aspects and different elements of the Irish community here. So yeah, would anybody else like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in myself. So I think, you know, there's a cliched expression of the hills far away are always greener, and it's doubly cliched when applied to Ireland, I suppose. But there is a degree to which I appreciate the country more, having spent so long away from it. And we're in a kind of weird bubble as diplomats, in that while we spend a very high percentage of our lives abroad, we're constantly engaging with home. I mean, we're following developments in Ireland more closely than most people in Ireland are following them, because we have to be able to interpret and explain those developments here. And it's a sort of essential component of our day-to-day lives. So in the way of a tourist, or maybe for those of you who've left home, you kind of have a deeper appreciation coming back to it of the beauty of the place. And for me, I've also kind of come to appreciate, you know, the relative strengths of our political system, of our institutions. I think when I was back in Ireland as a student, I mentioned I was very kind of active in student politics, and I would have fixated correctly on the areas where our country, you know, institutionally was failing, I thought, or could be improved at the very least, and the policy areas where we weren't, you know, succeeding to the extent I thought we should. But when you come to live and work abroad, and especially as a diplomat where you're dealing with, you know, representatives of every country in the world, I think it's given me a broader basis for comparing Ireland's performance as a country, you know, culturally and institutionally with others. And you know, in the case of what we're all experiencing right now with the COVID pandemic, that would be a kind of example that in Ireland, everyone is you know, deeply frustrated at the experience of the pandemic, has a very deep rooted sense of the injustice of it all, and would be very often very critical of how our country has managed it. But when you look at it in an international context, you know, by comparison with many peer countries, our situation is better than many, and not that diminishes a sense of responsibility or obligation that we should place the state on, but it does give you a sort of broader sense of and frame of reference, I think. I don't know, Sarah, Dermot, do you want to chime in on that, or we can move on to something else? We have lots of very other interesting questions.
Just like quickly, I mean, again, not to sound too cliche, and for want of a better word, sometimes it's, I guess, very humbling being here. I don't know, because I'm spoiled here in the Midwest, because we have such a large percentage here of the people who identify as Irish or Irish American, and sometimes just to see I guess the love and the pride that people take in having that Irish heritage, for me, sometimes it makes me take a step back, and it's like, oh yeah, that is really nice. So, to hear that, and to hear just in such high esteem that Ireland and Irish heritage is held in so many places here.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Yeah,
I've a question from Carla for you, Dermot, that I think is worth asking directly, which is, do you see people with an engineering or science background having something particularly useful to offer when serving as a diplomat? So I hope the answer in your case is yes. Otherwise, you're doing yourself out of a position.
Well, I've yet to discover my unique skill in diplomacy. So hopefully the scientific method will get me there. I absolutely do. I think having an analytical turn of mind is very useful, because there are lots of complex issues and things like that, and also, and I'm sure my vice consulate colleagues will attest, there is actually no shortage of admin as well, and having a methodical approach can help with that. So I think it definitely has a use, but it also, I think, should be tempered with a sort of a creative approach to problem solving. It's my qualification in chemistry is old enough to vote now, so it's been a while, but I think I was used to there being one correct answer, and that's rarely the case. In this job, you're looking for the most correct answer, or the best of available options.
Yeah.
So yes, the least worst. Yeah. So I think it's very useful as part of a suite of skills. But I think, again, going back to what Sarah said, there's no one route to doing that. Like, someone who has a more literary turn of mind could be of huge value in speech writing and formulating opinions. I know our head of disarmament, when I was in the disarmament unit, was a poet and wrote extraordinarily eloquent national statements. And I subsequently found out that this wasn't usual, that people would come up and say that was an absolutely beautiful address. Oftentimes, and no offense to colleagues of other nations, in a sea of dross. So there's all sorts of skills, and I think engineering and scientific definitely has its part to play. Also, I had an answer on the appreciation for the country, but I think you put it better than I possibly could. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Dermot. There's a really interesting and challenging question from Rachel Rosenberg, which I can offer a thought on, but maybe others want to come in first. And she speaks about the personal commitments we've all taken to representing our country in this case. But asks, have there been occasions where any aspect of our job has come into conflict with our personal opinions? And if so, how do we approach or manage that? Now, just to clarify, Rachel, Ireland is perfect in all ways. So this situation is a hypothetical one for us. No, not quite. I mean, the reality is, and this holds for every diplomat, whatever country they're representing, that there are instances where your views, because we all have political and personal views, are not going to align exactly with the country or the government of the day. And I mean, I've seen that in other countries quite a lot. I mean, a case in point for me, at least, would be a lot of British friends of mine, including colleagues who work at the British Embassy here and are just world-class diplomats. have to advocate for a position in respect of, leaving the European Union that, fundamentally doesn't align with their kind of sense of what's in the UK's national interest, or with their sense of joint values. But that is something you need to strike a balance with, and to some extent you need to set aside a little bit your personal views in the way that's consistent with the democratic expressed will of the country. There have been cases, and I remember one personal experience in my first year in Stockholm. Ireland in relative terms now is an extremely liberal country, and from my view, and I think for all of us across our generation, much the better for it. But it is not as liberal as Sweden, and certainly, even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, there were areas in our kind of official state policy in terms of treatment of women, and specifically in this case, the legality of abortion, where the position of the Irish state differed from that in Sweden. And we were subjected to protests outside our embassy in Stockholm in respect of this on occasion. And I would have had to go out and meet protesters, including representatives of Swedish political parties, and accept and listen to criticism voiced that they voiced, which at a personal level I would have been very understanding of, but our role as diplomats is ultimately to represent our state, and at a certain level anyway, you need to appreciate that and be able to, if not quite set aside your personal views, understand that your first and primary duty is as a representative of the country. I don't know, Sarah, Dermot, Paul, do you want to offer any thoughts or reflections on that question? It's a difficult one, as I said, but an interesting one.
Yeah, I know we're coming towards the end of the thing, so I'll just very quickly say, I think by and large, I feel quite lucky in that, certainly on the international stage, most of the positions, even if I might be a slight variance, I don't think there's any sort of, I've never been put in a moral quandary. But as you said, Ragnar, there are aspects of Irish society that have changed over the last couple of years that have made it certainly easier for me personally. But there are always times where it's where it can be a slight difference, and you're slightly swallowing back what your own opinion would be because your role is to represent the government of the state. But I would say I'm very lucky, and personally I've never had to take a position that I would be one of the people protesting against were I not in the job.
Thanks, Dermot. We have, I don't know, we're probably running out of time. So there's one kind of final quick question, which I thought willing to chime in on, or anyone else. Thank you for making time to speak with us today. How often are you able to travel back home, vacation time, etc.? Not enough is my answer. I haven't been home in a year and a half, but in truth, we get sort of reasonably flexible accommodation, and as far away as we are, psychologically, we're in Ireland every single day. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime back on that, or how your connection with Ireland might have changed in the course of your postings today.
I'll say briefly, probably of the four of us, the person who's been most recently in Ireland, I was there in the last month. I guess everything is kind of coloured by the COVID experience at the moment, and it's so challenging to get home at the moment. But I mean, typically for me, it's been 1 or 2 times per year since I've been posted here.
I'll just chime in and say the biggest challenge sometimes is trying to find a time when your friends and family are not visiting you on post, so that you can actually find the time to get home, because once you go on a foreign posting, you will have plenty of visitors. That is for sure.
You will if you're in Chicago. I don't know, you find yourself in some other parts of the world, there may be less frequent travelers. I think we're at the hour, so I don't know, we can wrap. I mean, generally, if Mary wants to circulate our contact details, and if anyone has any kind of particular questions we didn't have time to address there, we'd really happy to speak to you. But I think hopefully we gave some sort of broad reflections on what we think can stand people applying for positions in the foreign ministry of your representative country generally. And one addition maybe we didn't have a chance to speak with, but a lot of the colleagues from our intakes that were recruited, not all of us, had some prior experience of undertaking traineeships or internships with international organizations and multilateral organizations. In our case, very often the EU institutions in Brussels, or organizations connected to the United Nations. And that is a great way of opening out your experience and getting experience that's going to be relevant for a State Department. But it also means your potential career paths in international affairs are much wider than the sometimes quite narrow space of focusing immediately and only on the State Department or your foreign ministry. So I'm going to pass to Anna, if that's okay, just to say a few words. But thanks all for your attention.
Sure, thank you. Just to wrap up the conversation this afternoon, my name is Anna Dolezal, and I'm from the Nunavik Institute for European Studies. And if anyone who is listening in today is interested in learning more about diplomacy, about the skills necessary, or what the lifestyle of a diplomat really looks like, the Nunavik Institute is offering a course over the winter session in partnership with the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna on diplomacy and the life of a diplomat, with a special emphasis on how diplomacy interacts and contributes to social justice. So if you are interested in this course, it's not yet available on Course Search, but please shoot me an email or look at the website here where my contact information is listed. We hope that this course will be a good way to build some of those that our guests here today have shared. So please check this out if you're interested in learning more. Otherwise, thank you to the panelists today. This has been a really engaging conversation, and hopefully everyone enjoys the very Celtic holiday coming up tomorrow.